Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for coming here today, and welcome to our ABNY YP Talks, Keys to Housing Affordability for New York City Young Professionals. My name is Joshua Reyes. For those who haven't met me, I'm the program manager over at ABNY, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's YP Talks. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for coming today and engaging and listening from our fantastic panelists. Before I give the microphone over to Matthew, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our equally amazing moderator. Matthew S. Washington is Vice President and Chief of Staff at Phipps Houses, the oldest and largest not-for-profit developer, owner, manager of affordable housing in New York City. In this role, he's responsible for overseeing communications across all Phipps affiliated entities. He supports efforts that strengthen stakeholder relationships on land use and programmatic objectives, and assist in the overall coordination and integration of activities between Phipps Houses and its affiliates, Phipps Neighborhoods. Prior to joining Phipps, Matthew served as Deputy Manhattan Borough President in the Office of Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer. In that role, he oversaw the distribution of $130 million in funding to enhance parks, theaters, museums, hospitals, and affordable housing developments. In 2018, Matthew was named New York City 40 Under 40 Rising Star List, published by City and State. She said that, I did not. But in any event, thank you once again for coming. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Joshua, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. We're going to have some fun this morning, so get ready to have a good time is what I'd offer you. And thanks to ABNY for putting these conversations on. These are really exciting and excellent. Certainly as we think about the effort for ABNY to invest in young professionals, it's so important. I am sad to say that ABNY kicked me out of the Young Professionals group, so I was no longer worthy, or aged out, one of the two. But glad to be here this morning. We have an excellent panel. We're going to talk about some housing, some economic development. These are really hot topics, and I might throw in some wild cards in there, keep the panel on their toes, and we'll certainly open up the floor for all of you to ask some questions. For anyone who plays fantasy football, last night's game was something else, so I'm sure last night was a backbreaker or it took you to first place in the first week of the league. So, New York is a great place. Just excited again to be here. I want to introduce our panelists. We'll tell you a little bit about them. They're all pretty amazing in their own right. I'll give you a little bit of info. They can expand some more, and then we'll jump in. The one thing I do want to say is, thank you to ABNY for sending out an invitation with a picture of me from about 10 years ago. It makes me feel good. So it's, I'm like, oh man, there's no gray hairs in there. I was like, I look good in that picture, but good stuff, excellent. So I'll just start immediately to my left, go down the line, and we'll keep it moving today, and we'll certainly open up the floor for some questions from all of you, and I think Joshua will walk around with a microphone. So just want to remind our panelists that there's some microphones on the tables in front of you, but let's do it. We'll give some quick intros. So to my immediate left is Maya Kurien, who's Vice President of Advocacy at the Real Estate Board of New York. Maya has an incredible history in real estate and government and politics. She worked previously for New York State and New York City. Many of you may know or may not know a great agency called OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget. But those are the ones who are in charge of the budget. So Maya has been a steward of that and some other things. And Maya, just in terms of her academic credentials, has a bachelor's degree in social anthropology and master's degree in public policy from the University of London. And she has a great history working with the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD. Also, I will do my best to give the full name of an agency, and then I'll go into acronyms. We get into acronym soup a lot of time with some different things that we talk about, so I'll do my best to do that. But Maya, glad to have you. Thrilled that you joined us, and she's a superstar at Rebney, so I'll tell you that. Up next, we have Tracy Capune, who's Vice President at Kaufman Astoria Studios. Tracy has done some incredible work at Kaufman Studios, really expanding. Some of you have probably seen or heard about Stage K, which was really a big deal, a huge project. And Tracy has been very involved in a lot of projects. One we'll probably talk about a little bit later on is Innovation Queens, which many of you may have read about and heard about that, so we'll want to get some more info on what was going on there. But Tracy is working on some more expansion, and the work that's happening out at Kaufman Astoria Studios is really impactful for the economic growth of the city, and really making sure that we are still producing in New York City. And so thank you, Tracy, for making that happen. She has a master's in urban planning from NYU, New York University, and she has her bachelor's from the American University. So Tracy, glad to have you here. Barika Williams is Executive Director of the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, or ANHD, as we know very well. Barika has just really an incredible housing history. She was serving as Assistant Secretary for Housing for the state of New York, managing a small $20 billion pot and taking care of business in the state. She has serious credentials in housing, both in Washington, D.C., throughout New York, and really just a lot of great things. Barika is someone who is called on for her insight and wisdom. I think she only speaks on panels these days because she's so desired. So you'll find lots of videos of her online speaking on some different things, and really just an incredible asset to the city. She earned her master's degree in city planning from MIT with her bachelor's from Washington University in St. Louis. In 2020, the American Planning Association honored her with the Robert T. Ponte Award, just recognizing her work. And so she just really is someone who is quite a force in this industry. And in 2023, she was named as one of the most influential individuals working in New York real estate. So I was not, but so that's why I'm moderating and not speaking. And we're also joined by Assemblymember Brian Cunningham, Brooklyn in the house. So we are grateful for him. One of the things that Assemblyman Cunningham is proud of, his Jamaican heritage from his parents, and recognizing that work, but he's someone who has spent some time really, diving deep into the work and helping people, having spent some time at CAMBA, working on advocating for others and others' needs. A fellow with President Barack Obama's My Brother's Keeper Alliance, and so doing some stuff statewide, and has been very involved throughout the time. Assemblyman Cunningham and I had a chance to meet a number of years ago, just when he was on the grind. No sense of running for elected office, certainly externally, but just really committed to the work. And so, there's some people who get elected to office because they need a job, but Brian got elected because he wants to do a job. And so, just grateful for his commitment, the work that he does, and how he continues to fight for New Yorkers in Albany and also in the district. So got an excellent panel. So let's dive in. Let's jump in. We're going to talk again about housing and economic development today. I've got some questions here that I want to kick off, and they did receive a script for questions, but I like to go off script a little bit. So we're gonna mix it up and have a good time. All right. Yeah, just brace yourself. Throw out everything you receive. As we talk about housing, housing is such a big issue, such a great concern in the most populous city in the country, New York, 8.5 million people. There is a housing crunch. We are here at ABNY's Young Professionals meeting, and young professionals are struggling. Sometimes, 6 of them have to share a studio to make it work. And so as we think about housing and some of these real challenges that they face, what can be done to help, ease the pressure, that so many people are feeling. And I would like, especially, Tracy, if you highlight this, I would like everyone to respond to this, but also how do we make sure, that we have the right jobs in place, right? Because if you don't have income, you can't pay rent. If you don't have income, you can't buy a home. And so as we think about housing, it's inherently connected with economics. And so, what can we do to really begin to make sure that young professionals, those who are born and bred in New York, those who are coming, feel like New York is a place for them?
All right, not fair. How do I turn this on? Hi, everybody. I think some of it is expanding job opportunities to the economic development and the training point. The film and television production industry feeds a lot of different industries and historically was not very good about promoting training opportunities. We've changed that recently. Kaufman is involved with Brooklyn Workforce Innovations. They have a Made in New York training program. They probably cycle 4 or 5 cohorts through the studio annually. I have another one coming in a week. So that's one opening access. But I think it's also talking to the unions, the friends at Local 52 and the Teamsters, which also includes the makeup artists and the wardrobe folks. And, I think it's a tough industry to break into, and you don't make a lot of money until you really succeed in it. So I think it's about finding a way to pay your dues for a couple of years and be able to live here when you did it. When I first started after NYU, it was no benefits. I worked for the city. I made no money. And my husband and I, who was not my husband at the time, we were astounded at rent prices, and they've only gotten that much higher. But I think the Manhattan and Brooklyn I lived in the early 90s, there were a variety of housing choices. There were different levels of housing open. And today's housing conversation is so hyper-focused on deeply affordable, which is critically important. But I think we're leaving to the side the middle class and average housing for somebody who's a start-out person. So how do we increase supply, back to the economics, make it easier to build, make it easier for developers to build and force them to get a tax abatement like 421A or successor program, make them build different types of housing, link it to the policy, right? Like most developers I know would happily finance that and deliver permanent affordable housing as part of a private development. We were certainly willing to do that with Innovation Queens, so.
Thank you. And we'll loop around. Barika, why don't you take it next, then we'll go to Assemblyman Cunningham, and then come back around to Maya. And it's, young professionals are stressed out. How do we make sure they stay? How do we make sure they build New York? We need to invest in housing. We need to invest in economic developments. Barika, please.
Okay. Hi, everybody. And we're clearly going to get right into it, so it's good. I guess to start out with the bigger economic development question, believe it or not, ANHD has been doing this quite some time. We're 49 years old. We're one of the oldest housing advocacy organizations in the city. And we're founded by the original 7 or 8 community development, like a Phipps houses, like a Brooklyn Workforce Innovators, before there was really this kind of industry at all. About 8 10 years ago, 8 or so years ago, we made the decision to expand our membership portfolio and what we sort of specifically talk about. We've always been a community development-based org, but explicitly looked at economic development. And to your point, with our sort of tagline of how we think about this is no housing is affordable without a job, period, right? So we can't talk about one side of the equation without talking about the other. Similar to some of what Tracy said, actually, and I think a key part of that is how can people enter the workforce? And when you look at a lot of the national data, New York's in a strong position because some of the things that impede in other places we don't have. One of the biggest things you see in other cities and municipalities is how can I get to work? My car isn't working. Well, we've got, I had some problems today, but we have a public transit system, right? It is what it is. It's not always as reliable as we would like, but it's there, right? And so what really tends to what we know creates barriers for people are things like childcare, elder care, and things that have lower barriers to entry. Is everything going to still rely on a higher education degree? Can folks enter the workforce, especially the growing green workforce and EJ and climate-based workforce that we're seeing flourish off the coast of Brooklyn, right? So I think that's something, and one of the places ANHD is really focused on is industrial manufacturing. It's the highest income earning for the lowest educational attainment as focused on people of color. So if you are a person of color who has not gotten beyond a high school education, the sector that you are most likely to earn the highest income in is manufacturing, within the manufacturing sector, much of which includes film. So I think that all speaks to like we've got to do both sides of the equation, and it doesn't really work for us to, as a city overall, think about one side. That being said, we, New York City, kind of are doing this one place where maybe we're doing a little bit better, though we're starting to slide, in that we have a consistent housing focus generally year after year. Every other city does not necessarily have that, but our problem is running far away from what we're able to do and what we're willing to put into it and what the actual investment takes. And I think that's, quite frankly, a national trend, right? Where we don't see the conversations on the national level of like, how do we get housing costs under control the way we're talking about health costs, even though it's all of our biggest expense. For almost everybody, it's the biggest single expense that you have month to month. Here in New York City, I understand what Tracy's saying. I will say I don't think that quite aligns. We focus a lot on deeply affordable housing, also because we mainly focus on marginalized communities that are folks of color, immigrant communities, and who disproportionately end up being lower income. And I want to, we were talking about this before, clarify that we in the housing, especially affordable housing space, talk about income bands, and that is not the same thing as class, right? The number of Black middle class neighborhoods who are like, I want middle class housing, and I'm like, that's fine. When I put it up, you're gonna be upset because you don't qualify. Right? So the challenge is a lot of those 421A units are going to sound great and they're going to look great. And I have no problem finding a $3,000 apartment in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. I can find that at the drop of a dime, right? But that is far outside of what I am willing to pay and what most people I know are willing to pay, right? And so I think there's also this question of how do we make sure supply lines up with who we actually are as New Yorkers and what we actually need. I would love to find a $250,000 purchase homeownership opportunity. Good luck, right? I know tons of people who would love that. Good luck to them too.
Sign
right?
me up.
Say, right, exactly. And people are always like, do you have some? And I'm like, no, I do not. I don't have any. And so I think that's one of the struggles is like, in this housing supply conversation, how are we really making sure that what we're putting our government dollars into is generating what we actually need to get to our bigger problem?
I like that. That is a perfect segue. Government dollars, Assemblyman Cunningham, you got the money.
So the beautiful thing about going after two experts is you can say nothing and sound good, or repeat what they said over and just say it in a different way. No, anybody from Brooklyn in the house? First, let me do a Brooklyn check, just making sure. All right, Brooklyn's in the house. I love it. Let me just say one. I think we have a complicated housing crisis because it is not just on the state, just on the city, or just on the federal government. It is a three-part problem, and we need to address it at the same time. So let's start with the federal piece, because we talked about affordability and what that looks like, even if we did do a 421A plan or some kind of plan like this. 421A is deeply flawed because the affordable housing that we use is called, popularly known as AMI, average medium income, takes into account the 5 boroughs, Westchester, Long Island, which we know the incomes in each of those places are different. And when I think about the community I represent in Brooklyn, I represent 3 distinct communities: Flatbush, Prospect, Lefferts Gardens, and Crown Heights. Even if you were to do something in that community with average medium income, that looks very different. I was with a homeowner yesterday for my mother's birthday dinner, and I asked her, she lives in PLG, where homes are now $3 million as a starting point. If you want to fix her up at 1.5, anybody want to move in my neighborhood, please come on down. But she mentioned to me that when she purchased her home in 1977, the cost of a home was $35,000. $35,000 for a home on Parkside between Flatbush and Bedford. And if you know anything about that, it's close to 2 hospitals, SUNY Downstate, Kings County Medical Facility, a number of trains. You have the option of Q, the 2, and you got some outstanding jerk chicken from Pepper's down the street. Just wanted to throw a caveat in there for small business. But the realities are this community that we live in now, and in general, this is going to be the greatest transfer of wealth in American history in terms of people who purchased homes during the baby boomer era and in the 1970s. So on a federal level, we have to first figure out how are we going to change that AMI to CMI, which is community medium incomes, looking at community boards, specifically in New York, because we have a model that we know what community boards people make in those communities, and really driving our policy based off of that. I think you mentioned start with the policy. So let's start with the federal and let's get the AMI to a place where it actually reflects the communities we're building the housing in. I think from a city council perspective, certainly you have to look at the zoning and where can we up zone and where can we down zone or where can we contextually zone. I think that's a question, and obviously a lot of communities don't like the tall towers. You can go wide, you can go high. The reality is we have to create housing, and we have to figure out whether it's wide or high, but we have to figure out where does it make sense to do that zoning? Where do we have the infrastructure to do that, right, as well? And I think the city council has to grapple with the question of zoning. And on a state level, obviously, I think that the big elephant in the room was 421A, and whether or not we do 421A again or some version of it. Maybe we change the numbers. The reality is 421A, if you're going to create a tax subsidy, I think to your point, is that that tax subsidy has to work for the intended people that you want that tax subsidy to work for. So I'm not against the 421A plan. I think we should definitely have a subsidy, but the subsidy has to meet the demand. And I think the last piece of this is it wasn't a joke when we said there's $3,000 studio apartments. That is the average cost of rent right now in the city, particularly Brooklyn and Manhattan, for a studio. So you took about a 1-bedroom, you're at $35,000, a 2-bedroom, you're at $4,000, and a 3-bedroom, you're at $4,500. These numbers are mortgage level numbers. And I think one of the things that the city and state would be better fit to do, particularly in New York, is we know how to roll back gentrification and how to, not just roll back gentrification, but how to build communities is by creating permanent housing. And that means giving people an opportunity to own. And I think if we figured out a way to take some of those subsidies and do what we did in the past of giving people down payment assistance, they're clearly paying mortgage level, but not creating any equity, not creating any long-term stability. If we can create a down payment assistance program using those same subsidies that we're doing and make communities sustainable for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years, I think we'll better solve this crisis of the housing crisis and permanently keep people housed in communities.
Thank you. All right, Maya.
I don't know whether I like Matthew right now or don't like him right now for leaving me to be the last year. The problem with going after 2 experts and an elected official is you kind of end up having to hodgepodge everyone's answers. So I think look, let me just start from the place of, first of all, for those who don't know, REBNY, the Real Estate Board of New York, is the city's oldest trade association and largest trade association dealing with real estate, right? Now, what is real estate? I think that's a really good question. For those who don't know, right before I came to REBNY, I was executive director of government affairs at the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Under that year, we produced the largest number of affordable homes, including for, at that time, seniors, people with disabilities, people with low-income housing needs, supportive housing, than we ever had in history. And I was honored and proud to be asked to come to REBNY to continue that work through an equity-based lens to really work with so many brilliant colleagues and many brilliant members and partners, including those on this stage, right, in government and out of government, to really think about, what does an economic recovery look like post-COVID, and then how do we, right, we're still in COVID, but how do we, make sure that our recovery is better than the one we had before, right? So that's thing one. I think coming to that, right, as a 127-year-old organization, things take time to change. I would not have been sitting on this stage 127 years ago, I can tell you that. I'm not sure.
She wouldn't have been hired by them either.
No, correct, right? So, it doesn't look like it, but just a reminder, right, we are changing and we're proud of that change. And many of the folks on the stage and in this room are part of that, and we're grateful to all of you for your partnership. What is real estate once again, right? I think for a lot of people, and we all talked about how we're all involved in real estate in some capacity, it's a really nebulous term, right? I'll be honest, when I came to REBNY, I was like, oh, you build a house and rich people get richer and that's what it is, right? It's not. I think what I've come to learn and appreciate, and I think you've heard this theme from everyone on this panel, is real estate involves anyone who cares about their community, right? It's what goes in to making your community your community. You need housing, you need good jobs, if you're a kid, you want a place to play, you want clean streets, you want nice parks, right? That's what it means to be in real estate. And when you think about it that way, that's a very big spectrum, right? That is a lot of different work that goes into it every day. And so that means that you're not just gonna have one person fix it. It's not just gonna take one player. I know Assemblymember Cunningham is an amazing leader for, housing and affordable housing and economic development and all the things we've talked about today in Albany. But someone as amazing as Assemblymember Cunningham can't solve it by himself, right? Though it seems like he could, but he can't, right? So when you think about it that way, we all play different roles in this space, right? Everyone up on this stage, we're just some of the many people who play kind of an important role in this space. And so I would encourage you as we continue this conversation today, and as you think about all the viewpoints that everyone shared, to think about it through that lens, right? Everyone on the stage is important. This crisis is really complicated, especially when it comes to housing. It developed over dozens of years, right, literally, and that means it's gonna take a long time to get us out of it. We didn't get here overnight. It is a complicated crisis encompassing city, state, and federal levels. In some cases, international trends too, right? But that means that there isn't gonna be a silver bullet to solve it either, right? No one person, no one policy fix is gonna solve everything. I think when you look at the facts, it is really clear that we need more housing, period, right? We need more housing for everybody, and we need more housing in every neighborhood for all income levels, right? For all kinds of New Yorkers. And when you look at it that way, I think it becomes easier to understand once again, right, why this landscape's so complicated, maybe why you see some of those trends, why some of these tools exist. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about, question, tweak those tools to make sure they're working for New Yorkers today and work better tomorrow. But once again, right, certain tools that exist today were invented for a different city, right? And so I'll just stop, I'll start from that premise. So in terms of thinking about, housing, I'll give you a brief example. I think the reality is, if you look at the numbers, we do need a tax abatement to build housing, right? I'm not gonna go to the word that people don't like to mention because I don't want to get tomatoes thrown at me. But, I think you'll protect me. Matthew will dive in front of me and protect me from the tomatoes. That's an example where you need a tax abatement to build housing in New York City because it's so expensive to build in. You need a tax abatement to build affordable housing in particular because affordable housing is especially difficult to build, right? the point of affordable housing is that, and I say this as someone who grew up in affordable housing, I'm not giving you lip, I promise, but the whole idea is that families who, once again, maybe can't afford that market rate, right, that they have a shot at making it in this city too, and that we as a community are coming together to say, okay, we will work together and we will invest money in the parts of building housing that are really expensive, right? Like, raw materials, right? We have a a material raw goods supply shortage. We're gonna invest in keeping that low, but we're not gonna raise your rent as a working family, right? We're gonna make sure that you have the ability to stay in your home. So that's one example, right, where we do need an abatement. I think the second thing is, and the Assemblymember and I have, I think, had the pleasure of working together a little bit on this, is, we have a ton of office space in New York City that's underutilized on the commercial front. And Matthew, you should give me the hook if you want me to stop talking and move on. We do.
I'm the only one getting a hook around here, so you're fine.
Oh, okay. Well, sorry, Melva. We'll wrap it. I'll wrap up my rant. Okay, I'll keep talking. So we have an underutilized glut of office space. Now that doesn't mean we don't need office space, as Tracy mentioned and as Barika mentioned and the Assemblymember. Right, there are tons of people who need good jobs. We need a lot of different kinds of jobs. We want people to stay, live, work, play in New York City, in particular. But, we do have this office space that isn't going away. We have housing needs. So we've been really proud to work with the Assemblymember on thinking about how do we make it easier for some of those office spaces to convert to residential. That's not a silver bullet. That doesn't mean that every single office space is going to convert tomorrow. Not every office space is suitable for that. But it's a possibility, right? It is a tool in the toolbox that we can use collectively to start tackling our housing crisis. And so that's another example there. I'll just say as an example, like the other thing, the super tall buildings, that there is a misnomer about lifting the 12 FAR cap. I think for a lot of communities, that does mean a super tall building is going to get built in your backyard. What I've come to learn is lifting the 12 FAR cap is just about saying right now, if your building is zoned a certain way, you can only put so many apartments in that building, right? That seems kind of ridiculous, right? If you have a building that is already built a certain size, or you have a lot that you have like this room, I'd imagine you could put a lot of apartments if we pulled a super tall building, right, in this room. But if you can only put 3 apartments in that building because of the way the zoning works, it doesn't really make any sense. So lifting the 12 FAR cap is really just about making sure you can get the most bang for your buck, right? And these are examples of ways that we can work together collectively. And down payment assistance is another thing we should look at, right? There are many different needs, right, that we need to look at to tackle our housing crisis. But I just want to kind of take a step back, and I think that's what we're all trying to do here today, and make sure we're all thinking about it collectively as a complicated crisis that's going to need everyone in this room working together to think about how to turn this thing around. I'll stop being a Debbie Downer and I'll stop talking.
You're fine. Thank you all for your opening statements. It was good to hear from each of you. One thing just wanted to mention very quickly, Maya mentioned FAR, floor area ratio. For those who don't know, it just tells you how much you can build in a spot. If you have 12 FAR and you have a 1,000 square foot lot, multiply it by 12, you can build 12,000 feet. And so that's sort of the poor man's version of FAR. I want to get back to you, Assemblyman Cunningham. A couple of things, or one of the things that sort of came up in this conversation was 421A. Some of us love it, some of us hate it. The reality is a lot of housing has been built using 421A. Sort of what happens next is important. But one thing that I would love to hear your comments on, the governor launched the New York Housing Compact, a plan to build 800,000 units of housing throughout the state of New York. As we saw in the budget, it didn't succeed. So what's next for the New York Housing Compact? So if you would just tackle those, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Questions keep getting harder and harder.
Hey, we're gonna get in there, baby.
No softballs today. No, so I think last year, I think we were all put in an uncomfortable position. The governor was elected.
I was okay.
Yeah.
No problem.
the legislator and the governor were put in a very uncomfortable position. I think the governor's election happened sometime in November, obviously, and we went back to session pretty quickly in January. And I think there wasn't sufficient time to socialize some of the documents, particularly on the housing front. And I think we were all kind of at the state of the state hearing some of this stuff for the first time. And I think part of that wasn't enough time for us to kind of munch on it a little bit. I also think the big key thing here is one of the things that the Assembly and the Senate tries to do is we try not to do policy in the budget. And I think we talk about housing policy, it needs the kind of time and deliberation to kind of go through hearings and conversations and talking to the right stakeholders. I think when an item that big is in the budget, it kind of sours the pot, if you would, and I think we wish we had an opportunity to kind of do that stuff outside the budget. So I think this session, given the fact that we have a session coming up in January, I think you'll see, and again, we talk about FAR, I put a standalone bill in for the FAR. I kind of broke apart the housing compact and looked at the things that made sense, both for my community and what I think makes sense for the city and the state, and I introduced pieces of legislation I thought addressed those parts versus trying to tackle a big thing like the housing compact. The other big thing with the housing compact, we talked about AMIs, turning those AMIs, average medium incomes, into CMIs. I think housing is also a very specific and local thing that you need local input on. And I think one of the things the housing compact did not sufficiently do for members upstate, downstate, Long Island, and across the state of New York was it didn't give municipals enough control to have those conversations specifically about their housing needs. Housing in New York City looks very different from housing in Buffalo or in Long Island. Infrastructure is a huge thing. We talked about infrastructure earlier as it pertains to jobs. I'm fortunate to sit on the Economic Development Committee and also on the Energy Committee. What does that look like for each part of the state? Is there sufficient water, lighting, train stations? Is there good bedrocking? Is this a good place to build? Are there enough schools? I think those are very hyper-local conversations that have to happen on a very local level, and I think the Housing Compact kind of said, here's a big fix-all silver bullet. And again, I think you mentioned earlier, Maya, that there is no silver bullet to housing. Every community is going to look different. They're going to want input differently. They're going to want to do their housing differently. But I think the point is we need to build more housing because the demands are high. There are more people coming to New York for work and for other reasons. And I think we just need to figure out a way to kind of workshop that and socialize that document and have deeper conversations in the session. And a lot of our colleagues are doing that right now, even off session.
Thank you for that, and you're a much nicer man than I. I would have probably said there's some terrible people who should have approved the housing compact because we need to build housing. But that's my outsider opinion. We got to build. There's a need. One of the things that Maya talked about was building housing for everybody. Affordability is a term that we often think about as it relates to low-income households because that's what the subsidy programs are structured for, but affordability means something different to each person. Barika was talking about not wanting to spend $3,000 a month on rent. I've seen apartments at $6,000 for rent, which is it's why I live in New Jersey. So, yeah, we'll get you back. Find me an affordable apartment. Yeah, that's crazy. And so we have this mix, but we need to build, right? We see that the average rent in New York City goes up and up and up. And some people say we just need more supply. Is more supply the answer, or is something else going to address it? And anyone can take it. Barika, why don't you jump at it first?
It's not the only answer.
Yeah.
We can't build our way out of this. I feel like that's a misnomer for us as like a bigger housing community. And to go maybe even further back than what Maya was talking about, I would edit that. Hopefully most folks are in real estate or what Maya said, but there are people in real estate for not those reasons and purposes and intents. And I think we see that, or maybe they are focused on a very certain audience of what they mean for their purpose. And I think we see that come out in some of the things around the housing compact and land use. And how do you navigate wanting to the Assembly member's point, to give municipalities some power when what some municipalities want to do with that power is say, I don't want this type of person, this type of family, this type of background to locate in this neighborhood. Because that's what some people want to exercise with that power. And I think that's important to bring it all the way back to like meta housing context is we've never done this right. So let's also like ground ourselves in America has never successfully maintained housing for communities of color that is affordable, safe, quality, not discriminating, and not concentrating, period. We just have never done it. So what we're also trying to solve an affordability crisis built on a fundamentally flawed framework, right? Like that's just the reality. And so I think we sort of struggle with not always wanting to talk about more supply and an open framework doesn't necessarily get us to what I would think is our ultimate goals. We talk a lot about down payment assistance, but I may qualify for down payment assistance. Some of the folks in here may qualify for down payment assistance, but if co-ops and condos can deny me approval without any reason or rationale, if I'm being steered by a broker out of a specific neighborhood, and if I'm not being approved for mortgages and loans disproportionately because of my race or my gender or my family composition or my immigration status or my sexual identity, the down payment assistance is worthless. It's moot, right? And so I think it's not just a supply problem, right? I think is the hard part. Does that mean that we can then just say, we're not worried about supply? No. Right? We do have to build. And I think it's funny because like ANHD sometimes gets to like, you guys are anti-development. And I was like, we are a development organization. Half of our members built and developed. Actually, half of our members built and developed before most of the people who are developers ever existed in New York, just to be clear. But the question is like, how are we, they're thinking about what's going up in Prospect Lefferts, what's going up in Crown Heights, what does Astoria need, right? And it's a different kind of focus. And I know Tracy's gone through this with Innovation Queens of sometimes they ask for things and you're like, I don't know if that pencils out. I don't know if that works by the numbers. We try to do a lot of work of talking to our members about there's what we want, and then there's what's financially feasible, and what can policy help bridge. People say all the time, it should be 100% affordable. And I'm like, that's great. Do you have unlimited pools of free money, right? Like, I would love that. People are like 50-50. We can do that in certain very specific scenarios, but we actually don't have the resources and the ability to do that writ large. Now, some of that is a policy decision. Some of that is where we're applying capital. You mentioned the famous words OMB. We would love for them to, free some stuff up. But, I think we recognize that there are real numbers behind this. And we don't want to ever be in a place where we as a city are just like, hands off, we're not doing anything. And I think actually from a policy conversation, what's a little nervous and a little bit maybe worrying to the assembly member's point of like breaking things off into pieces is where we don't want to get is that we do nothing instead of saying like, well, we have the perfect of everything. Because then we're frozen, then we're San Francisco, then we're, they're getting better. But, and they have pieces that they're doing well. But I think there's some bigger questions in there.
Sure. No, definitely. Thank you for that. One of the things you talked about is sort of who's building and what someone's intentions are. I think when we build and we think about housing, we need everybody to build. Phipps houses where I work, we only build based on HPD term sheets. So it's all low, moderate income families, households. So if anybody in here, is a single person and earns $120,000 a year, you cannot live in anything that we build, because our mission doesn't support that. So we have a very specific focus. Is it bad to have a focus? Do we need someone to build market rate since we're only building, at these lower income bands that Barika was talking about earlier? And so it begs the question, how do we use planning as a tool to address some of these things? And so, Tracy, can you talk a little bit about Innovation Queens? there were challenges that it faced. It got approval, but we may still not be in the clear. But how does a project like Innovation Queens begin to address the need that we have to have housing for people who can pay $500 a month and housing for people who can pay $6,000? And just very quickly, as you hold on to that, I think the Assemblyman needs to slip out of here soon. You got 5 minutes. I do have a question for you before you leave, though, and there is a right answer and a wrong answer to the question. So, please, Tracy.
I'm not coming back anymore.
Thank you.
I love Matt.
So,
He'll be back.
so
Oh, I'm not coming back. Fair.
Barika said something very, very true, and it made me realize that during the entirety of the Innovation Queens process, I joked around that I walked around with a ginormous algebra equation in my head, because it was always like, there is this pool of money, how do I spend it? And I will go so far as to say the underlying zoning can be better improved by rewriting the policy so it better reflects not segregating zoning doesn't work anymore, right? Updating it so that a mixed-use environment is possible in a more as-of-right setting, and doing it so that you are not excluding all of the historical populations that were excluded. It's figuring out how developers are expected to spend, I think my number was somewhere upward of $200 million to improve the sewer system just to make it up to code, because Western Queens hasn't seen that improvement in years. That's money that doesn't go into housing. We built into our proposal, before we workshopped it to the community officially, 6 years ago, when Melva was still at Borough Hall, we convened stakeholders throughout the community and asked them their opinion, including the community board. They gave us their opinion, and then when we officially went back to them, they said, no, we never said that, right? So it was really challenging, and Astoria in particular, good people, but we had staunch support in Queensbridge and Astoria houses in Woodside, because these are folks who live in tall buildings now. They like the workforce development initiatives we were putting in place. They like the fact that we were giving space to 13 community organizations already serving the community and growing their capacity. They really, really were welcoming to us, and we found the folks who were the most vocal opponents were the single-family homeowners or the two-family homeowners who didn't want to see any change. And you are correct, we were far from perfect, but rather than having a constructive and substantive, nuanced conversation, the opponents engaged in a lot of political theater, and that's not helpful, because saying 45% affordable housing doesn't make it financeable or ultimately buildable. And in our case, what I said earlier, I recognize that AMIs are flawed, it's all flawed. But if you have somebody who's willing to spend, put in the percentage, it could be 45% and maybe pencil out if I could finance it not using HPD money, right? How do we make developers invest in the affordable housing, and how do you balance it against the other investments you're already requiring the development community to make to build anything, including investing over $12 million to get through ULURP with this project? That's a stupid sum of money, and I would much rather spend it in the community building. It was ridiculous. And, you know, and I know Western Queens is a little bit of a crazy town sometimes, but, you know, I live there as a business. I don't live there personally. I'm on the Upper West Side in Connecticut, but I live in Queens. I've been there for 15 years. I remember a time when everybody worked collaboratively before Amazon. And we got a lot of stuff done, and I really, really would hope we can get back to a collaborative dialogue, because just talking past one another, let me be clear, if I lose site control, Kaufman Astoria Studios is going nowhere. The Long in the Tooth movie theater will not get the upgrade they want if they stay in business after this, right? PC Richards and its sea of parking is not the highest and best use of that site. And the Queensboro dairy sites and all their ancillary folks that have month-to-month tenants, what's happening there? They need huge environmental cleanup. It's been a defunct business for, 25 years or so? How are we doing this, right? So I just feel like not doing anything is a missed opportunity that none of us can really afford. So how do we get back to collaborative and not political theater?
Yeah. No, thank you. Not political theater from the lady who has theaters and studio spaces. Amazing. No drama. Assemblymember Cunningham. There's a right answer and a wrong answer. Based on the district you represent, you may be predisposed to one of the answers, but it may not be the right one. The question to you is Knicks or Nets?
This is always the right answer. Brooklyn. I'm a Brooklyn. I mean, let me say this.
That was the wrong answer.
Let me say, the Knicks is the historic team of New York, but I'm a Brooklyn guy. When you put Brooklyn anywhere, I am all in on Brooklyn.
that.
Sorry.
Yeah, I appreciate that. On a more serious note, and thank you for your time. We appreciate you making the time and appreciate your work in Albany and in the district. My Brother's Keepers Alliance, this is work that you've done, clearly very important across the country. How critical, one of the things that is important, Barika earlier was talking about knowledge of some of these things. We see discrimination in housing, we see other things that are going on. How critical is the work that you were doing there and other work to educate people on housing, to educate people on economic opportunities, and how important is that for this conversation?
Yeah, great question. I mean, working at my Brother's Keepers Alliance was a lifetime job. Just getting the chance to see the president's vision up close on how we expand opportunities for boys and men of color across the country. One of the things that we knew very early from the MBKI stage, was the initiative stage and was kind of embedded in the White House, was the idea that this work can't be parachute work, that we had to do deep work in communities and empower groups like the Canvas, like all the local organizations that had access to young people. And I think similarly, what I learned from that is on the housing front and also on the economic development front is that you can't have this Albany 160-mile approach to anything that happens in community. It takes deep community partners who are underground in Queens and different boroughs in the city, in Buffalo, throughout the state. So I think that was the biggest lesson learned. But I think we started a conversation, how I will end it, it'll certainly continue, is economic development is a huge part of this conversation, and the fact that this isn't thing that is oftentimes taught specifically to communities of color. And I think that is something that we're trying to break up the monotony and try to figure out, like, how do we go deeper, even with our public education system? How do we include things like these conversations where it's not just math and science, but it's not just balancing the checkbook, because those days are over too. It's really understanding development, civic engagement, and all those things, and all the above. So I think there's a huge opportunity space with 1 million students that pass through our public school system every single year to really do some of that deep work that we're doing with My Brother's Keepers Alliance on the economic front, on the housing development front, but specifically, again, we talked about green jobs earlier, and I think the key part here is that green collar jobs are white collar and blue collar jobs with a green purpose, right? It's reshaping and rethinking the narrative on how we talk about opportunities for today. 10 years ago, you would never think about having a social media director on your staff. Now you have to think about the impact that social media has on direct media and how people consume media. So I think we just have to figure out how to continuously evolve both on the economic side, on the housing front. I know that you mentioned earlier that 1 and 2 family homes were like the standard. Now we're looking at bigger buildings, and even when we had buildings that was 6 stories, that was tall for folks who lived in single family households. We have to be in the mindset of innovation, creativity, and helping kids to think critically about those things, because they're going to be the people that actually solve these issues that are complicated, deep. We are really just laying the foundation for the next 20 years, but it's going to be their job to implement it and to change course when necessary.
That's awesome. And what word of advice, wisdom would you share with this young professionals group as we think about economic development and housing, and what would you encourage them all to do next?
I think the big thing is think out the box. I think it's easy to kind of look at a box and see 4 corners, and there are people who don't really color in the lines, and those people are the people who create, innovate, and create the next big companies, whether it be the Amazons of the world or the Facebooks. These are big companies, big mega corporations. But it really took someone thinking outside the box. And I think in this room, I look around at some very familiar faces, and I know that the capacity, the intellect is all here. It's just about doing that and also keeping closely connected. Again, just looking across the room, I think about so many people that I've worked with in different situations, scenarios, people on the panel that I worked with years ago when we were at Borough Hall and City Hall. So I think keeping those relationships close and just thinking outside the box and figuring out how to create new industries and new innovation.
Assemblyman, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all.
We
Appreciate it.
you. Appreciate you. And back to it, back in action. Maya, I've got a question for you. Tracy was talking about innovation queens.
It's the Knicks, sorry.
Oh, I mean, that's clearly Knicks, right? We can all agree it's the Knicks. Thank you. Tracy just let us know that in Western Queens, it costs $200 million to flush your toilet. Very expensive toilets in Western Queens. You know, one of the things that has come up is the cost of development. You represent a lot of developers, as do you, Barika. You represent developers. You know, I think sometimes there's this idea that, you know, it costs, you know, X to build affordable housing and X squared to build market rate housing. But when you look at things like sewer upgrades, that's a fixed cost. When you look at many people want to see union work happening, those are fixed costs. And so this conversation about the cost of development, you know, how can we help people understand that, and how are your members dealing with the fact that some things are fixed irrespective of the type of housing, and how does that balance out?
Okay, let me see if I can keep up with Matthew's question, but would obviously love Barika and Tracy to jump in here too. Yeah, apparently it does cost a lot of money to fix a toilet, so thanks for that figure. Whole sources,
yes.
Sorry. No, I mean, I think Tracy got into it a little bit. I think, you know, and I say this with the understanding that, you know, not just from my time at HPD, but prior lives, you know, in a personal capacity, I'm on the board of a community development, affordable housing developer who does the kind of work that Phipps talks about and the kind of work that Barika's members deal with every day, you know. So, you know, you see this, I've seen this from a lot of different angles, and I think one thing is clear, our members do have to make the kinds of choices that Tracy talks about, right? They do build affordable housing. They build a lot of affordable housing, as do many people, right, including folks on this stage. But there's some costs that you can change, and there's some costs you can't. The costs of going through ULURP is a thing our members can't change, right? We talk about community input. No one's saying there should be no community input. I think it's about finding that balance, right, of community input and getting things done. But it is expensive. I think some of the debates we've talked about in Albany, for instance, of giving communities local control, you know, the Assemblymember's bill that would basically allow for a bigger rezoning greater than 12 FAR basically gives New York City more control, right, about where it is and is not appropriate to build greater than 12 FAR. Thank you, Matthew, for that FAR explanation for dummies, even for me, frankly. But, you know, right, that's an example of giving the city more control, more input over what does and doesn't make sense. The mayor just proposed, or the Department of City Planning, I should say, just proposed a ton of potential zoning reforms, right, that are targeted at taking a look at our land use system in the city and saying, all right, some of these things kind of made sense ages ago. You know, like that PC Richards in the parking lot. I grew up going to that PC Richards, so I'll pour one out. But, you know, everyone loves them. But the point is that really where it should be now? No. But if you're not allowed to build there, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So we do need to take a look at our land use system. We do need to think about what makes sense for today. We need it to be more flexible, to build even things like childcare centers and schools, right? We need to accommodate the needs of climate change. That's not going away. But you can't do that if your hands are tied. And it's those kinds of outdated things that add to cost for developers. Now, in terms of stuff like labor and unions, you know, I'm very proud of REBNY for a lot of reasons, but our members almost exclusively work with 32BJ, right? Our buildings have 32BJ members employed, and that's a really good thing. We try wherever possible to build with the building trades and have had a really good partnership with them. And those things are important. Our member, I think as an industry across the spectrum on the whole, between ANHD, REBNY, NYSAFA, there are tons of players in the space. We're all committed to, as you heard, keeping New York families working, keeping New York families housed, right? And we're always looking for ways to do that. But if you're making those choices, which are expensive, that means you don't have a lot of money for everything else, for the 45% affordable, for the 50% affordable. Some of that is also, though, I think this was addressed earlier, limited resources, right? I'll give you an example, like the federal government could be doing more on this. There are plenty of reforms, right, to really nerdy tools that I won't get into, but just stuff like, the private activity tax exempt bonds, right? We could be getting, yeah, exactly, bond cap. We are limited right now in New York City in terms of the amount of public bonds. And have been for a long time. Which makes it really hard. And those bonds aren't just used for housing, they're used for sewer upgrades, lots of upgrades, right? There are community development block grants that the city uses to build hospitals and maintain hospitals in the city on certain sites. That was key through COVID, right? We are limited in the amount that we get. There's a cap on those block grants. And those are the kinds of things where, yes, the city should invest and continues to invest and talks about it, but we also have to think about where we're constrained in real ways. And so our members do continue to think about that mandate. They will continue to, I think they are working as creatively as they can, working, for instance, with Tracy's company, Kaufman Astoria, to build, Innovation Queens is a really good example, or to get that, in the ground. Obviously, working with many of Barika's members on some of these smaller projects. Obviously, Phipps is a great partner. We work together for a reason, right? It's to think about being creative and meeting that mandate. But I would just say, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I would encourage you all when you're thinking about your role as housers, right, and the work you want to do in this space, to really do your homework, right? Do your research. Don't be afraid to ask any of us questions or anyone questions that you come across about what they're dealing with or what tools are out there, where we're constrained, where you could do more. And don't be afraid to weigh in as a constituent and tell your elected officials that this matters to you. Another example is community boards. I think approximately 50% of community boards in the city have really met the call to building more affordable housing. I think they've built less than approximately like 500 units. What is it over the last decade? It's like not a great number. It's not great. So there's more work to do there, right? You all care about your communities. If you're on a community board, which I think several of you probably are, would be my guess, you can, that's a place right there where you can say it right there. I used to work at OMB. I do not work at OMB anymore, to be clear, and I was not on the housing team at OMB, for the record. I was on the social services team. But, that I think OMB is an example of an agency that has a pretty tough job, right? You talk about resources. If they have a budget, they've been given X amount of dollars, and they are told this is what they have to spend across the city, across all its functions, across all its needs, its roads, its sewers, its homes, its hospitals, its social services, what have you. They unfortunately have the terrible job of having to fight it out. It's like Hunger Games in there, right? I speak from experience. It is like Hunger Games. You gotta really do the best you can to prove the case about the programs. And we should not, as a city, be putting New Yorkers in a position where, city services are up for grabs, right? Or as a housing community, we should not be in a situation where all of us are trying to make choices between those sewer upgrades, those community development upgrades, those amenity upgrades, those critical life-saving health and safety upgrades. That's not the way it should be. So once again, our members are in a better position than most, but what I like to say is if our members are thinking about it, everyone else is, right? And so that's something to think about too.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
I'm gonna ask Barika to add a comment, and then after Barika, we're gonna open it up for you all to ask some questions, so I can give the panel a break from my battery of questions. So.
No, I wanted to add something in to both what the assembly member said, but what Maya said. So, just thinking about, and what Tracy said about sewers, there's actually a neighborhood, there's an area in New York City that is still largely disconnected from the sewer system entirely, the well out in Cypress Hills. So just think about like how we spend our money, and that there is a place in New York City where you actually are like not connected to a modern day sewer system at all. Willett's Point also, right? It's just crazy. So to everybody's point, like, it's like, what are we doing with the resources that we have, right? It's not that we necessarily don't agree with the idea that we should be using tax breaks and tax incentives for affordable housing. Our question and problem is like, is the mechanism that was created some 30 years ago the way that we should be still applying this? Because 421A was created when nobody was building, and it had no affordable housing requirement in it. It was just like, please don't abandon New York City, build here, right? And so the question is like, what do we do with $1.7 billion a year worth of tax breaks? And how do we best want to apply them, right? And then I think to the political theater question, I feel like this is a critical piece to lift up, because the trajectory is it's just going to keep going, and especially for folks who are engaged in this space and in this work, I think it's important to both think about why it's happening and then how you engage in it. You know, there was, for most of New York City's time, if you were a wealthy white neighborhood, you would go to your elected official, you'd say, no, I don't want this, and it wouldn't happen. And so what we've created is this like theater, performance, very like less than, it's not a very beautiful or very coordinated dance that everybody goes through, whether it's ULURP or Albany or whatever it is, that we have these conversations around. I think one of the things we've been phrasing is like, we do need to be mindful and cautious of both, like, nobody likes the system, literally nobody likes the system that we have. None of us. It's terrible, right? Like, we can't work on every single ULURP project. We don't do all of them. We don't want to do all of them. It's not great. And also, we do need to be mindful of, we put a system in place for a certain period of time, and that has been the rules. And now that communities of color and electeds of color have gotten the education and understanding of how to exercise that system for their community's needs, that we are now starting to talk about, well, like, let's change the rules, right? That's actually like, it's both like the system is not great, and there are reasons to be mindful of not just like unilaterally changing the system that disempower people who have built up figuring out how to have power, right? 4th Avenue's rezoning was never not going to happen. And what that community was going to get was like little nibbles. And now, fast forward, the idea that we could actually kill a neighborhood-wide rezoning was unheard of 6-7 years ago. And that is consistently happening during the de Blasio administration. And so now we've got to sort of think about, like, how do we not create a logjam for everything, and also not change everything in a way where we sort of like take those communities' gained power back.
That's right.